Forget what you were taught about World War II in history class, especially if you grew up with Western textbooks, where the Eastern Front is often squeezed into a couple of paragraphs somewhere between El Alamein, Sicily, and Normandy. Hitler didn't lose the war in Berlin, and not even just at Stalingrad. The German army's backbone was finally broken in the summer of 1943 in the fields around Kursk. This was where the Wehrmacht launched its last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, throwing in its elite units, its new tanks, and everything it could still scrape together after the disaster at Stalingrad. And this was where that offensive choked and died so badly that from that point on, Germany never truly attacked again. It only retreated, snapped back, and gave up mile after mile until the war reached Hitler's bunker. Over the next 40 minutes, you'll get 20 facts about the largest battle in human history. Monster tanks, dogs carrying explosives, a pilot with no legs, intelligence mind games, a captured Panther tank roaming the German rear, and the one day after which the Reich's best armored units never really recovered. Fact 1. Let's start with the scale, because without it, you simply cannot understand the Battle of Kursk. This wasn't one clean, cinematic tank duel the way documentaries sometimes make it look, and it wasn't just the battle near the village of Prokhorovka, even though that's the episode most people remember. The Battle of Kursk lasted 50 days, from July 5th to August 23, 1943, and for all that time, across a massive section of the front, there was a non-stop meat grinder. Artillery barrages, tank attacks, air raids, night raids, counterattacks, attempts to break through the defenses, and attempts to hold those defenses at any cost. In the active phase alone, both sides committed more than 2 million men, around 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, almost 4,500 aircraft, and tens of thousands of guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. To understand the scale, this wasn't one army versus another. This was a clash between gigantic war machines, each throwing in everything it could still gather after Stalingrad. For Germany, this was the last attempt to regain the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, to prove that the Wehrmacht could still do more than defend, that it could still dictate the course of the war. And here's the key point you need to remember right away. After Kursk, the German army never again, never, launched a major strategic offensive in the east. Yes, the Germans would still counterattack, hold defensive lines, hit hard, and make the Red Army pay a brutal price for every mile. But the direction of the war had changed forever. Before Kursk, Germany could still hope to turn things around. After Kursk, all it could do was delay the inevitable. Fact 2. Now here's the thing that breaks the mental model for a lot of people in the West. Everyone knows Stalingrad, but almost nobody understands that Kursk was bigger. Stalingrad absolutely deserves its place as the symbol of the turning point in World War II. It was a catastrophe for Germany, a psychological hammer blow, the destruction of Paulus's entire army, the capture of a field marshal, and the first moment when the whole world saw that the Wehrmacht could not only be stopped, it could be surrounded and forced to surrender. But if we're talking about scale as a military confrontation, the Battle of Kursk surpassed Stalingrad in the number of forces involved. Across all its stages, the Battle of Stalingrad involved a little over 2 million people. Kursk, if you include the entire period of fighting, the defensive and offensive operations, the northern and southern faces of the salient, the reserves, and the follow-up offensives, involved more than 4 million. That makes Kursk one of the largest battles in human history, and by some estimates, the largest battle ever fought by number of participants. And here's why this matters for an English-speaking audience. In Western pop culture, World War II often feels as if the main land war began in Normandy in June 1944. But by that point, the German army had already been ground down in the east on a scale that is hard to even imagine. Kursk was not just another battle somewhere in Russia. It was the moment Germany threw in its elite units, its best armored formations, its new machines, huge reserves, and its entire hope of revenge after Stalingrad, and lost. So when someone confidently tells you Stalingrad was the biggest battle of the war, you can calmly correct them. Stalingrad was the most famous symbol of the turning point, but Kursk was the largest battle in terms of forces committed, and the place where German strategic initiative died for good. Fact 3. Now let's talk about why the Germans went to Kursk in the first place, and here we have to talk about Hitler's big bet, his so-called wonder weapons. After Stalingrad, Germany was in a very dangerous position. The myth of invincibility had collapsed, the Allies were pressing harder from the west and south, German industry was under extreme pressure, and the Red Army was no longer the army of 1941 that could be trapped in huge pockets by the hundreds of thousands. Hitler needed a major success, not a local victory, not just holding the line. He needed a strike that would restore the feeling of power, proof that Germany could still attack, encircle, destroy, and impose its will. And the trump card was supposed to be the new heavy tanks. First and foremost, the legendary Tiger. This thing was a monster. Frontal armor around 100 millimeters thick, a powerful 88 millimeter gun, excellent optics, and a terrifying effective range. A Tiger could knock out a Soviet T-34 from a distance where the T-34 crew still had to get much closer just to have a real chance of penetrating German armor. For a Soviet tanker, running into a Tiger wasn't some cinematic duel. It was a matter of seconds. If it saw you first in open terrain, you were in serious trouble. Each Tiger cost an enormous amount of money, required complex assembly, skilled workers, expensive materials, and time. But Hitler believed quality could beat quantity. Alongside the Tigers, the Germans brought in the new Panthers, technically medium tanks, but with armor and firepower far beyond earlier German vehicles, and the heavy Ferdinand tank destroyers, huge armored beasts with guns capable of killing tanks at long range. For Soviet soldiers, the Panther and Ferdinand were not just new machines, they were psychological weapons. Imagine sitting in a trench. You know German tanks by their silhouette, by their sound, by their usual tactics, and suddenly something huge, unfamiliar, heavily armored, and hard to kill starts crawling toward you. The Germans were counting on exactly that: a new strike, new technology, shock, breakthrough, encirclement. But that bet had one fatal weakness. Wonder weapons don't save you when the enemy knows where you're coming and spends months preparing your grave. Fact 4. If the Germans were betting on quality, armor, range, and the technical superiority of individual machines, the Soviet Union had a very different approach. Mass production, repairability, simplicity, and the ability to fight in the real conditions of the Eastern Front. The main Soviet hero was the T-34. And let's be honest here, without patriotic fairy tales or poster slogans, in a straight one-on-one frontal duel against a Tiger, the T-34 had serious problems. The German tank was heavier, better protected from the front, had a more powerful gun, and could open deadly fire from a distance where the Soviet tank had to maneuver or close in under fire. But war is not a video game where you put two tanks across from each other on a flat map and compare stats. In real war, speed matters. Mobility matters. Fuel consumption matters. The number of vehicles still running matters. The ability to replace parts, train crews, repair damaged tanks, and send them back into the fight matters. And that is where the T-34 was brutally effective. It had sloped armor that increased the chance of ricochets, wide tracks that helped it cross ground where heavier machines could get stuck, a diesel engine, a relatively simple design, and most importantly, it was produced in huge numbers. The Germans built Tigers almost like expensive mechanical works of art, slowly, carefully, and at high cost. Soviet factories in the Urals and Siberia pushed out T-34s in a constant stream, thousands upon thousands, often under horrific conditions, with workers putting in 12 and 16-hour shifts, living near the workshops, and knowing that every tank would go straight to the front. This was the cold industrial logic of a war of attrition. You can build the most advanced tank of its time, but if it breaks down, requires complicated maintenance, exists in small numbers, and spare parts are unreliable, it becomes a luxury problem. And if the enemy can lose tanks, repair tanks, build new tanks, and throw them back into battle, your technical elite starts drowning in numbers. Kursk was not just a clash of tanks, it was a clash of two military philosophies: Germany's expensive engineering power against the Soviet industrial meat grinder, where the key question wasn't how brilliant one machine was, but how many machines would be back on the field tomorrow. Fact 5. Why did all of this happen near Kursk specifically? The answer is geography, and it matters more than it may seem. By the spring of 1943, after the winter fighting, the front line had taken on a strange shape. Around Kursk, there was a huge bulge pushing deep into German-held territory. On the map, it looked like a giant tongue pointing west, or like an arc, which is why it became known as the Kursk salient. It stretched for hundreds of kilometers along the front, and pushed so far into the German lines that any staff officer looking at the map would see the temptation immediately. Strike at the base of the bulge from the north and south, close the pincers, cut off the Soviet troops inside the salient, and create another massive pocket. That was exactly how the Germans had fought in 1941, when they encircled Soviet armies near Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and Vyazma. They knew this game. They were masters of it. So from the German point of view, Kursk was almost an obvious target. The northern force would strike from the Orel area. The southern force would strike from the Belgorod and Kharkov area. Somewhere deep behind the Soviet lines, the two claws were supposed to meet, close the ring, and destroy everything trapped inside. The plan was called Operation Citadel, and there was a certain irony in that name. The Germans intended to crush the Soviet defenses, but in reality, they were about to attack a fortress the Red Army had spent months building specifically for them. The German command hoped to repeat old victories, but the problem was that this was no longer 1941. Soviet staffs had learned to read a map as well as the Germans. The troops were more experienced. Communications and command had improved. Artillery was denser. Industry was running at full power. The Kursk salient really was a dangerous bulge, but it also became a giant trap, and the Germans were preparing to walk into it almost on schedule. Fact 6. And here's where we get to a point that is rarely shown in heroic retellings, but explains very clearly how shaky the whole operation was from the start. Some of the German generals themselves opposed Hitler's plan. Not Soviet propaganda, not historians speaking with hindsight. The actual men who were supposed to lead the attack. General Walter Model, commanding on the northern face, was cautious, tough, and experienced. He had seen the Soviet defenses. He had studied aerial photographs. He saw the density of fortifications, minefields, artillery positions, and reserves, and he understood perfectly well. There would be no quick breakthrough. According to accounts, he brought Hitler photographs of the Soviet positions and basically showed him, "Look, they're waiting for us. They know where we're going to hit. They've dug themselves into the ground for miles and miles." Manstein in the south was more inclined toward maneuver and believed success might still be possible under the right conditions. But even within the German command, there was no unified confidence that Citadel would be an easy path to victory. The longer the operation was delayed, the stronger the Soviet defenses became. And Hitler delayed it precisely because he wanted to wait for new Panthers, more Tigers, and more equipment. On paper, that sounds logical. More tanks means a stronger blow. In reality, every extra day meant Soviet sappers laid more mines, infantry dug more trenches, artillerymen registered more firing zones, scouts refined more positions, and reserves moved closer. It was a race of preparation, and Germany was losing time. When your generals are saying, "They're waiting for us, the defenses are too strong, the element of surprise is gone," and your answer is basically, "Luck must be on the Reich's side," that is no longer strategy. That is gambling. And Hitler put the last strong cards he had in the East on that bet. Fact 7. Now let's talk about intelligence, because this is where the story gets really interesting. The top-secret German plan for Operation Citadel was known to the Soviet side before the offensive began, and not from just one source, but from several independent channels, which is crucial. One report can be a mistake, a rumor, or deliberate disinformation. But when different intelligence networks in different countries start saying the same thing, the high command cannot simply shrug it off. Soviet intelligence was getting information from Switzerland, where the network of Sandor Rado was operating. Information also came through Britain, linked to Allied analysis and decoded German communications. The group known as Dora sent messages to Moscow about the concentration of German troops and preparations for a major offensive. Partisans and frontline reconnaissance reported movements of tanks, fuel, ammunition, and engineering units. The nature of German preparations itself was screaming one thing: they were going to strike here. Yes, Soviet intelligence was not perfect. Sometimes it got the timing wrong. Sometimes it overestimated or underestimated forces. There were disputes over the direction of the main blow, but the overall picture was clear. The Germans were preparing a major operation against the Kursk salient. They planned to attack with pincers from north and south. They were counting on an armored breakthrough. Now imagine the psychology of that moment. Hitler thinks he is preparing a powerful strategic move, while on the other side, his plan is being read almost like an open book. It's like playing poker when your opponent can see your cards and calmly lets you keep raising the stakes. The more you put in, the worse the loss will be. Fact 8. Knowing the German attack was coming, the Soviet command faced a choice: strike first or wait. And this was not some simple staff room debate where one option was obviously smart and the other obviously stupid. Striking first sounded very tempting. If the enemy has concentrated troops for an offensive, that means he is vulnerable. Equipment is on starting positions, supply dumps are forward, troops are grouped together, and there is a chance to disrupt the whole operation before it begins. But that option carried a huge risk. The Germans were still masters of mobile defense and counterattack. If a Soviet offensive ran out of steam against prepared German positions, the Red Army would burn through the very forces it needed to absorb the main blow. Marshal Zhukov proposed a different approach. Take the hit on prepared defenses, wear down the German armored units, knock out their vehicles, force them through minefields, artillery, anti-tank zones, and then, when the attacking enemy lost momentum and reserves, commit fresh Soviet armies and launch a general counteroffensive. It sounds simple, but in reality it required nerves of steel. You know the enemy is about to strike. You can see the preparations. You could try to hit first. Instead, you deliberately wait, let him make the first move, and trust that your defense will hold. After discussions with Zhukov, Vasilevsky, and other commanders, Stalin chose exactly that. Defend, grind the enemy down, then attack. With hindsight, it is easy to say, of course that was the right choice. But at the time, it meant taking enormous responsibility. If the defenses had collapsed, if the German pincers had closed, if a million-man grouping had been trapped, the consequences could have been catastrophic. But the calculation proved correct. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do in war is not charge forward, but build a wall and let the enemy smash himself against it. Fact 9. Once the decision was made to defend, the defense had to be built so deep and so tough that it would be almost physically impossible to chew through without horrific losses. And this is where the scale of Soviet preparation at Kursk becomes staggering. The entire frontline zone was turned into a giant fortress. These were not just trenches in a single line, like in old war movies. This was a deeply layered defensive system. Multiple trench belts, communication trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, artillery positions, dummy positions, observation posts, camouflaged batteries, counterattack zones, prepared fallback lines, and new resistance lines behind the first ones. A German tank was not supposed to break through a line. It had to pass through an entire meat grinder, where every next mile became a new problem. In some sectors, the density of mines was incredible, with anti-tank and anti-personnel mines laid by the thousands per kilometer of front. And these were not just random mines scattered around. They were part of a system. Mines were meant to stop tanks or force columns to turn into areas already covered by artillery. Anti-tank ditches were meant to break momentum. Trenches and machine gun points were meant to separate German infantry from the tanks. Because a tank without infantry support deep inside a defense becomes vulnerable. It can be set on fire, outflanked, hit from the side, cut off from support. The construction involved not only soldiers, but local civilians, women, teenagers, old men, anyone who could hold a shovel. They dug, carried logs, built shelters, camouflaged positions, often under the threat of air raids. And all of it was done with a clear understanding. German armor was coming here soon. Not in some abstract future, but in weeks or days. The Kursk defense was not just a line on a map. It was a pre-built killing mechanism designed for one very specific attack. Fact 10. But the battle actually began before the first shot was fired on the front line. It began in the German rear, on the railways, because without railways, a modern army simply cannot fight. Tanks do not run forever on their own. They need fuel, shells, spare parts, repair workshops, bridges, flat cars, trains, communications, food for crews and infantry. In 1943, most of that moved by rail. So, Soviet partisans were given the task of attacking not only garrisons and isolated German columns, but the bloodstream of the Wehrmacht itself. Operations known as the Rail War and later Concert became large-scale attacks on German communications. Partisan units operating in occupied territory blew up rails, switches, bridges, trains, stations, and communication lines. Sometimes these were major coordinated sabotage actions, with dozens of sections exploding at once. Sometimes they were tiny groups crawling up to a rail line at night, planting a charge, vanishing into the forest, and by morning, a German ammunition train could no longer get through. Blowing up one piece of rail may sound small, but in war, logistics is everything. If a train is delayed by a day, tanks may run out of fuel on the very day of the attack. If ammunition does not arrive on time, artillery falls silent. If repair parts do not make it through, damaged vehicles sit uselessly in the rear. Just picture it. At the front, German generals are demanding shells, fuel, and reserves, while in the rear, railway crews, guards, and engineers are desperately repairing tracks that get blown up again the next night. This was a war without parades and without much space in Western textbooks, but its effect was real. Partisans who had no Tigers, no aircraft, and no heavy artillery struck at the one thing without which all that German power became metal without gasoline. Fact 11. Now the tension reaches the breaking point. The Germans are ready to begin the offensive. Soviet troops are waiting. Everyone knows the blow is about to fall, but the exact hour still matters enormously. In early July, just before the operation, a German sapper named Bruno Frommel is captured by the Soviets. During interrogation, he gives up critical information. German units are on combat alert, and the offensive will begin during the night of July 5th. For the Soviet command, this is the moment when a decision has to be made immediately. If the information is correct, German troops are already in their jump-off positions, artillery is ready, infantry is waiting for the order, tanks are warmed up, engineers have prepared lanes. And the Soviet command decides not simply to wait for the blow, but to launch a preemptive artillery strike, a counter-barrage. In the night of July 5th, Soviet guns open fire on areas where German troops are concentrated, on batteries, command posts, and likely routes of movement. Imagine being a German soldier in those minutes. You've been told the offensive is about to begin. You're sitting in cover, waiting for the order. All around you are vehicles, ammunition, men, everything wound tight. And suddenly, Soviet artillery crashes down on your positions. This did not destroy the German operation outright, and we should not exaggerate it, but it disrupted the tempo, created confusion, delayed attacks in some sectors, interfered with command and control, and most importantly, showed the Germans one thing. There was no surprise. They were waiting for you. They had figured you out. You haven't even started attacking, and they are already hitting you. Sometimes, in a gigantic battle, the first hours can be changed by one captured sapper, one sentence delivered at the right time, and one headquarters decision made without hesitation. Fact 12. When the Germans finally moved forward, the story became one of simple, cheap, well-prepared weapons breaking complex and expensive German machinery. On the morning of July 5th, German tank columns advanced toward the Soviet defenses. They used dense combat formations, with heavy vehicles up front to crush firing points and punch a path, followed by other tanks and infantry. In theory, it looked powerful. Heavy armor, experienced crews, artillery preparation, air support. But in practice, from the first minutes, the attacking forces started running into minefields. A mine does not need to blow a tank into pieces. It only needs to tear off a track, damage a road wheel, and stop the vehicle. And a stopped tank is no longer a predator. It is a target. Especially if it is stuck in a pre-registered fire zone where Soviet gunners already know the range, direction, landmarks, and are waiting for the armor to expose its side. The Germans tried to deal with mines using engineer teams, mine-clearing devices, and special equipment, including remote-controlled demolition vehicles. But the density of obstacles and fire made clearing lanes a separate kind of hell. Soviet sappers sometimes worked almost under the noses of advancing tanks, restoring minefields, laying new charges, and closing passages the Germans had just opened. And here the brutal economics of war became clear. A Tiger that cost a fortune and months of work could be stopped by a cheap mine buried in the ground by a sapper. Yes, it might later be recovered and repaired if the Germans held the field. But if the advance stalled, if artillery was falling, if recovery vehicles could not get close, if Soviet guns were hitting the area, then a damaged tank became a loss. The German armored fist ran straight into ground that had been turned into a trap. Fact 13. Since we're talking about artillery, there's one important thing to understand. Soviet troops had to invent new ways of dealing with German heavy tanks because they had no easy choice. Penetrating a Tiger from the front was difficult. The new German vehicles forced tactics to change on the fly. If guns were spread thinly in a simple line along the front, a German armored wedge could smash through one sector, suppress individual guns, and keep moving. So Soviet artillerymen began creating anti-tank strongpoints, defensive nodes where several guns, crews, anti-tank rifles, machine guns, and infantry groups worked together as one trap. The point was not to heroically fire into the front armor until everyone died. The point was to lure tanks into crossfire. One gun crew might fire first, draw attention, force a German tank to turn its turret or hull, and at that moment, other guns would hit from the flank, into the side, the running gear, or other weak points. The distances were often suicidally short, a few hundred meters. For an artillery crew, that meant if you missed or failed to penetrate, there might not be a second shot. A German tank could answer fast, and its shell would leave almost nothing of the crew. But this tactic gave them a chance. The defense was not built around the idea of every gun for itself, but around a system of fire, where a tank that broke into a gap suddenly found itself under attack from several directions at once. This worked especially well on the northern face, where Rokossovsky's troops had prepared for the German attack with extreme care. German progress there was far slower than they had expected. Every mile cost mines, artillery fire, ambushes, counterattacks, and lost momentum. And a tank breakthrough lives on speed. Once speed is gone, breakthrough becomes attrition. That was exactly what the Soviet defense was designed to do. Fact 14. And now, Prokhorovka. On July 12, 1943, the area near the small station and village of Prokhorovka became the symbol of the entire Battle of Kursk, even though in reality it was only one incredibly dramatic episode of a much larger battle. In popular memory, Prokhorovka is often called the largest tank battle of all time, and historians still argue about that. They argue over the exact number of tanks, the losses, what counts as one battle, and what counts as a series of engagements. But if you set the academic debate aside and look at the human level, the picture is still horrifying. In a limited area, hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns, infantry, artillery, and aircraft all collided. Soviet tank crews understood that at long range, German Tigers and other vehicles had the advantage. So they had to close the distance, get in close, almost point blank, turning the battle into chaos where seconds, nerve, maneuver, and luck decided everything. The battlefield quickly filled with smoke, dust, burning fuel, and earth thrown up by explosions. Tanks burned, ammunition cooked off, turrets were blown off. Crews tried to crawl out of vehicles that had turned into furnaces in seconds. In conditions like that, normal time disappears. There is only engine noise, shell impacts, shouting over the intercom, the driver's next move, a flash ahead, a hit, smoke, another shot. One participant, Lieutenant Penechko, remembered a roar so powerful it pressed on the eardrums. Blood came from the ears, metal tore and screamed, and only one thought remained. While you're still alive, hit the enemy. That is real war without Hollywood polish. Not a beautiful wide shot, not heroic music, not slow motion. Just red-hot steel, dust, fear, rage, and men inside metal boxes who know they may not exist 1 minute from now. Fact 15. Prokhorovka was not just a terrible fight. It was the moment when the German attack on the southern face finally lost the momentum that the whole operation depended on. It is important to be careful here. Exact losses are still debated, and different sources give different numbers. The Soviet side suffered enormous losses, in some places far heavier than the popular version admitted for a long time. But the strategic meaning of the battle was different. The German grouping failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, failed to break out into open operational space, and failed to accomplish the objective of Operation Citadel. Its tank units were worn down, vehicles were knocked out, crews were lost, repair services were overwhelmed, reserves were shrinking. In the skies over the Kursk salient, another war was raging at the same time, and Soviet aviation was increasingly active against German tanks, columns, crossings, and rear areas. Small anti-tank aerial bombs were used, which aircraft could drop in large numbers. For a tank column, that was terrifying, because even a small bomb hitting the roof of the hull, the engine compartment, or landing close enough could disable a vehicle. It was during the Kursk fighting that Ivan Kozhedub, future three-time hero of the Soviet Union and one of the top Allied fighter aces, began his path to fame, shooting down his first aircraft in the summer of 1943. But the main story was unfolding on the ground. German armor, designed as the tool of breakthrough, was becoming an exhausted resource. In popular retellings, people often say that in a single day, the Germans lost up to 3/4 of their tanks on that axis. Even if we argue over the exact numbers, the core point remains the same. After Prokhorovka and the whole series of battles on the southern face, Germany no longer had the strength to continue Citadel as a victorious offensive. Its blow did not become a catastrophe for the Red Army. It became a catastrophe for German hopes. Fact 16. And now we get to a story that many people in the West simply refused to believe at first. Dogs really were used against German tanks. Yes, anti-tank dogs. It sounds almost insane, but war often looks insane when you look at it up close. The idea was grim and simple. A dog was trained to look for food under a tank, then an explosive charge with a detonator was strapped to it, and the animal was supposed to run under the enemy vehicle, where the armor was thinnest. In practice, it was more complicated and more tragic. Dogs could panic, get confused, run back, or react to sound and smell differently than the trainers expected. There were cases where this weapon created danger for Soviet troops as well. But at Kursk, these units were used, and in some episodes, they really did disable German tanks. In one well-known account, a platoon under Lieutenant Lisitsyn used dogs to blow up several German vehicles and then continued holding its positions. To a modern viewer, this can sound wild, cruel, almost impossible. But picture the reality of 1943. Tigers and Panthers are coming at you. You don't have enough heavy guns. Every tank might punch through the line, and behind you are positions, hospitals, headquarters, roads, towns. In that kind of war, people used everything that could stop armor. Mines, Molotov cocktails, bundles of grenades, anti-tank rifles, direct-fire artillery, aircraft, dogs. This is not a nice story. It is a terrifying one. But these details show just how desperate the struggle was and what kind of price was paid to stop the German war machine. Fact 17. At the same time as the fighting on the ground and in the air, another war was being fought. Invisible, quiet, but no less important. This was the war of intelligence, counterintelligence, radio messages, codes, double agents, and disinformation. Shortly before the Battle of Kursk, the Soviet Union created the counterintelligence organization known as SMERSH, and the Kursk salient became one of its first major tests. The Germans tried to send agents into the Soviet rear to learn about reserves, attack directions, the state of the defenses, the locations of headquarters, airfields, and supply depots. Soviet counterintelligence, in turn, caught agents, took over their radio sets, and began playing the game with German headquarters in their name. Operation Experience was one such example. Soviet counterintelligence officers sent radio messages to the Germans, supposedly from agents operating in the Kursk area, feeding them carefully prepared false information. This was not just lying over the radio. Good disinformation has to look believable. It needs details that match what the enemy already knows. It has to feed his expectations while quietly pulling him off course. The Germans received these messages, analyzed them, compared them with other data, and made decisions without realizing that part of the picture had been painted for them by the enemy. At the same time, SMERSH intercepted supplies German intelligence dropped for its agents: money, documents, weapons, radios, equipment. So the Germans were being hit not only with shells and mines, but with information. They tried to look inside the Soviet defense. Instead, they were staring into a mirror the Soviets had placed in front of them. Fact 18. The next story is about human willpower, and every time you hear it, it sounds almost impossible, even though it happened to a real man. Alexei Morozev was a Soviet fighter pilot. In 1942, his aircraft was shot down over enemy-held territory. He survived, but he was badly wounded, alone in the forest, and had to make his way back to Soviet lines. Through snow, cold, hunger, pain, frostbite, with no proper food and no medical care. When he was finally found, his legs were in such terrible condition that they could not be saved. Both legs were amputated. For an ordinary person, that alone would be a life-changing tragedy. For a fighter pilot, it seemed like the end of his profession. A pilot has to feel the pedals, withstand G-forces, work with his legs during landing, maneuvering, and combat. But Morozev refused to accept that ending. He learned to walk on prosthetics. He trained. He fought to return to service. He convinced the medical board that he could fly, and he came back. Not to a desk job, not as an instructor somewhere far in the rear, back into the cockpit of a combat fighter. On the Kursk salient, he fought in the air again, and on July 20th, 1943, he shot down 2 German aircraft while helping save his comrades. Over the course of the war, he shot down 11 enemy aircraft, most of them after losing his legs. Think about that for 1 second. A man with no legs returns to a fighter plane where every movement, every reaction, every fraction of a second decides whether you live or die. This is not some motivational quote from the internet. This is a level of willpower that is hard to even process, and that is why Morozev's story hits so hard. Behind the millions of numbers, tanks, operations, and fronts, it reminds you that the war was carried by specific human beings, sometimes pushing beyond what seems physically possible. Fact 19. Before the finale, here's a story that feels like a ready-made scene from a war movie. After the fighting at Kursk, the Red Army captured German vehicles, including Panthers. Usually, captured equipment is a headache. You need spare parts, ammunition, knowledge of the design, crews have to learn how to operate it, and your own side might mistake you for the enemy. But sometimes that problem could become an advantage. There is an account of a Soviet tank regiment using a captured Panther in a daring raid through the German rear. And the trick was that German artillerymen and soldiers did not immediately realize they were looking at an enemy. They saw the familiar silhouette of a German tank, so they assumed it was friendly. In war, a split second of hesitation can be very expensive. While someone is figuring things out, while someone is checking, while someone hesitates to open fire on a vehicle that looks German, the tank has already moved farther, taken position, struck, and gone deeper. That is audacity bordering on genius. Using the enemy's own weapon, its silhouette, its reputation, and even its recognition habits against him. Of course, that kind of disguise could not work forever. Sooner or later, the Germans realized something was wrong and started hunting it. But the episode itself shows how far war is from the simple formula of our tanks versus their tanks. At the front, people used everything. Captured vehicles, German machine guns, enemy trucks, seized documents, uniforms, radios, routes, habits. If it gave even the smallest chance to strike, they used it. And a captured Panther calmly moving through the German rear because everyone thinks it belongs there is one of those episodes that sounds unbelievable, but perfectly captures the logic of war. Victory is not only about who has more steel, but who can think more boldly. Fact 20. And now the finale. Why Kursk changed not only the Eastern Front, but the entire course of the war. When Operation Citadel failed, it was not just a failed German assault. It was the collapse of Germany's last major attempt to regain the initiative in the East. The Germans lost men, machines, time, momentum, and most importantly, the strategic ability to choose where and when the decisive battle would happen. After stopping the German offensive, the Red Army went on the attack itself. The operations around Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkov pushed the Germans back, and the front line began moving west in a way that could no longer be reversed. On August 5th, after the liberation of Orel and Belgorod, Moscow fired an artillery salute for the first time in the entire war. This was not just a nice gesture, it was a signal to the whole country. We are no longer only holding on, we are liberating cities. And then came the domino effect. While Germany was grinding down its best forces at Kursk, the Allies landed in Sicily. Mussolini's regime soon collapsed. Italy began to leave the war. Japan became more and more convinced that attacking the Soviet Union from the east was far too dangerous. In Washington and London, it became increasingly clear that the Eastern Front remained the main place where the fate of the German army was being decided. Even German commanders later admitted Kursk's importance. Manstein wrote that Citadel was the last attempt to preserve the initiative in the east, and after its failure, the initiative passed permanently to the Red Army. That is the real meaning of Kursk. Not one dramatic episode. Not only Prokhorovka, not only Tigers, Panthers, and T-34s. The point is that after the summer of 1943, Germany could no longer win the war in the East. It could only retreat, hold lines, hope for a political miracle, hope the Allies would split, hope for new weapons, hope for anything. But the military logic was already working against it. So there it is, the battle you've never heard about. Kursk was the place and the moment where the German army's backbone was finally broken. Everything that came after, the Dnieper, Operation Bagration, the Vistula, East Prussia, Berlin, grew out of the turning point that happened in the summer of 1943 on the Kursk salient. The German machine was still dangerous. It still killed. It still resisted with savage force. But it was no longer moving toward victory. Personally, the story that hits me the hardest is Moresiev, a man with no legs who got back into a fighter cockpit and kept shooting down enemies. What hit you the hardest? The anti-tank dogs? The Smersh radio game that made German headquarters believe a fake picture? The minefields where expensive Tigers were stopped by cheap charges buried in the dirt? Or the captured Panther that rolled through the German rear like it owned the place? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to see which part stuck with you the most. And if this video was useful, if you learned something new and now see World War II differently, hit the like button and subscribe. On this channel, we break down history without fluff, without whitewashing, and without convenient myths, just how it really happened. See you in the next video.